You are standing at a small gas station on the outskirts of Texas, watching the price board tick up a few more cents, wondering why your wallet keeps getting thinner every single day. Very few people realize that the key to their financial future sometimes has nothing to do with Wall Street or the White House. It lies in a narrow strip of water just 20 miles wide on the other side of the world, called the Strait of Hormuz. How Iran turned its geographic position into an economic weapon, and why every time Hormuz shakes Wall Street, and the wallets of ordinary Americans shake with it. The current situation is clear even when the daily flood of news makes it easy to go numb. Hundreds of oil tankers sit anchored offshore. The automatic identification systems that every commercial vessel is required to broadcast have gone eerily silent across one of the busiest shipping corridors on the planet. But the impact does not stop there. International crude oil prices have at times surged past $100 a barrel. Major marine insurers have collectively pulled war risk coverage for vessels transiting the Gulf. Tanker charter rates have nearly doubled within just a few trading sessions. Behind those dry numbers is a simple truth. Every price move in the global energy market will eventually show up on the number display at the pump where you fill your tank. This is personal analysis drawn from public sources, including the U.S. Energy Information Administration, major outlets like CNN and Reuters, and respected policy research institutions in Washington. Nothing you are about to hear is investment advice, financial guidance, or a recommendation to vote for any party or candidate. Every argument in this video has its limits. The situation on the ground can shift within days. A back-channel negotiation could reverse the oil price trend. An unexpected decision from the Federal Reserve could send financial markets in an entirely different direction. If you stay until the end, you will see a pattern forming right in front of you. Not just with Iran, but with any nation that controls a choke point in the global system, whether it is a strait, a pipeline, an undersea cable, or a semiconductor supply chain. You will understand why a small strip of water in the Middle East can determine the cost of a 30-year mortgage for a family in Ohio, and why decisions made in the shadows of the Persian Gulf echo inside American voting booths on Election Day. The question is simple. Do you want to walk into that voting booth with your eyes closed, or with a clearer view of the invisible forces pulling the economy you live inside? Right now, the first question we need to answer is a simple one, yet it is almost always overlooked. What does the Strait of Hormuz actually mean for the United States? On a map, it is nothing more than a narrow channel, roughly 20 miles across, at its thinnest point, sitting between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. But on balance sheets and economic reports, Hormuz is the passage through which approximately 1/5 of the world's crude oil must travel to reach the market. Every single day, somewhere between 15 and 20 million barrels of oil move through this bottleneck, originating mostly from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran itself. Even though the United States became a major oil producer through the shale revolution that accelerated around 2008, oil prices are still set on a single global market. When a shock hits Hormuz, the market does not simply ask how much oil the Middle East is short. It asks how anxious the entire world has become. That anxiety shows up immediately in futures contracts on the New York Mercantile Exchange, then filters down into retail gasoline prices, and ultimately into the inflation numbers the Federal Reserve has to watch every single month. But rising gas prices are not just about spending a few extra dollars to fill the tank. For many Americans, that difference is the line between saving money and reaching for the credit card. When oil prices climb, freight costs go up, grocery prices go up, consumer goods go up. The Fed gets pushed toward keeping interest rates higher for longer to contain inflation, making a 30-year home loan more expensive. Every time Hormuz rattles, it is not just equity markets that feel the shock. The most ordinary financial decisions in American households get quietly pulled along with it. That is why across decades of U.S. national security documents, freedom of navigation at choke points like Hormuz has always been classified as a core national interest. Not simply because Washington wants to play the role of global policeman, but because any prolonged disruption there can destabilize the American economy at precisely the most politically sensitive moments. In an election year, a few extra cents on the gas price board is enough to change how voters answer the question, how would you rate the state of the economy right now? If you understand that picture, you begin to see clearly why Tehran always mentions Hormuz whenever sanctions push it toward the wall, and why every American president, past and present, has had to think very carefully before deciding to send additional warships through a stretch of water that looks almost anonymous on a map. In modern history, few places have demonstrated the leverage of a small strait more vividly than the Persian Gulf did during the 1980s. At the time, Iran was locked in a brutal, drawn-out war with Iraq. Both sides understood that to break the other, they had to strike at the flow of oil. Instead of fighting only on land, the war spilled onto the water, onto the oil tankers threading through the exits and entrances of the Persian Gulf, with Hormuz as the single most critical bottleneck. Americans came to know this period by a name that has since become a case study in military academies: the Tanker War. At the height of the conflict, hundreds of commercial vessels were attacked. Mines were scattered across major shipping lanes. Ships flying neutral flags were no longer safe. Iraq focused on striking Iran's oil infrastructure, while Iran responded by targeting tankers belonging to nations it viewed as backers of Baghdad, particularly Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. The message was unmistakable. If Iranian oil could not reach the market, then no one else's oil could pass through that strait safely either. In the language used today, that was the first time Tehran deployed Hormuz as a tool of collective punishment. For Washington, the tanker war posed an uncomfortable dilemma. On one side, the United States could not allow Iran to freely hold international shipping lanes hostage because that directly threatened Western energy security. On the other side, any military move risked dragging America into a direct confrontation at a moment when the country still carried the wounds of Vietnam. However, as Kuwaiti-flagged tankers kept getting hit, insurance costs spiked, and oil prices began responding, the White House had no choice but to act. The U.S. agreed to let certain Kuwaiti vessels fly the American flag in exchange for military protection, and launched a convoy escort operation that many historians describe as the largest of its kind since World War II. The defining moment came when an American destroyer struck an Iranian mine in international waters. That event triggered a sharp response from Washington, a brief but intense military campaign targeting Iranian naval vessels and support facilities in the Gulf. Tactically, the United States won clearly. Multiple Iranian ships and platforms were destroyed. Iran's surface naval capability was significantly degraded. However, viewed through a long-term strategic lens, the story is not simply that America won and Iran lost. Both sides walked away having learned very different lessons about how power works at Hormuz. For the United States, the lesson was that protecting a shipping lane in shallow, mine-filled, small boat-infested water costs far more than anyone initially expects. Keeping the oil flowing required maintaining a massive military presence at enormous expense, both financially and in terms of human risk. A handful of cheap mines, or a small cluster of inexpensive speedboats deployed in the right place at the right time, could compel the most powerful military on Earth to scramble warships, aircraft, and an elaborate convoy system. For Iran, the lesson ran in the opposite direction. Despite suffering heavy losses, they came to understand something fundamental. They did not need to defeat the U.S. Navy on the open water. They only needed to raise the cost of American intervention high enough to achieve a form of strategic success. Looking back from today, you can see that during those brutal years, Iran laid the first foundation stones of what would eventually become their asymmetric advantage at Hormuz. They understood the logic clearly. In this kind of contest, the weaker side does not need to sink an entire fleet. The weaker side only needs to make every decision to defend freedom of navigation. Expensive, politically difficult to explain to taxpayers, and loaded with risk. For ordinary Americans, even those who had no idea any of this was happening, the events in the Persian Gulf during that period began shaping how every subsequent president would calculate the true cost of any crisis involving Hormuz. To understand why a country like Iran can leverage a small strait against the entire world, we have to look inside the machine that Tehran spent decades constructing. The first layer, the oldest but still effective, is the naval mine. Iran has accumulated a stockpile of sea mines across a wide spectrum of types, ranging from simple contact mines anchored to the seabed all the way to more advanced variants capable of activating in response to a vessel's magnetic signature, acoustic profile, or pressure change. In the shallow, confined waters of the Persian Gulf, seeding mines at just a handful of choke points is enough to force any fleet considering action to stop and recalculate. Mine clearing operations, which require specialized vessels, helicopters, and unmanned systems, invariably cost far more in time and money than the mines themselves did to deploy. That is the clearest illustration of cost asymmetry. The weaker side uses cheap tools to force the stronger side to spend expensively. The second layer sits on the surface of the water, and it consists of thousands of fast attack craft operated by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. These small, high-speed boats carry anti-ship missiles, rockets, torpedoes, and in some cases, kamikaze configurations. No single one of them compares to an American destroyer in terms of firepower, but they are extremely dangerous in confined spaces. Operating in swarms, exploiting the complex terrain of the Gulf, they can close and harass strike and scatter before a larger adversary can mount a full response. Every such encounter forces the U.S. Navy to deploy radar systems, helicopter assets, close-in defensive weapons, and at times expensive interceptor missiles just to protect its own ships. Above the waterline, the third layer consists of drone systems and shore-based anti-ship missiles positioned along the Iranian coastline and on islands that Tehran controls. Surveillance and attack drones, which cost a fraction of what a manned aircraft requires to build and operate, allow Tehran to maintain constant surveillance and persistent pressure over every warship and tanker moving through the region. Shore-based anti-ship missiles, if activated, can create a bubble of danger over portions of the airspace and water surface around Hormuz that no navy can simply ignore. To counter them, the United States must maintain air defense systems, missile interceptors, and electronic jamming assets, none of which come at a low price. Finally, hidden beneath the surface and inside the invisible spectrum of radio waves lies the fourth layer, midget submarines and electronic warfare. The shallow bottom and complex underwater terrain of the Gulf reduce the effectiveness of the long-range sonar systems Western navies typically rely on in open ocean. Small submarines specifically designed for these conditions can approach shipping lanes, deploy mines, gather intelligence, or launch surprise attacks. Alongside them, electronic warfare units can jam GPS signals, radar systems, and communication networks, leaving opposing vessels unable to accurately fix their own position, unable to distinguish civilian craft from military ones, or to identify which signal among hundreds of competing ones represents a real threat. However, a layered defense system only has value if the adversary believes it will actually be used when the moment comes. Iran understands this, which is why they regularly conduct large-scale exercises, fire shore-based missiles on camera maneuver speedboat flotillas through the strait, and fly drones visibly over Hormuz. Each time the purpose goes beyond training. It is a message sent directly to Washington, London, and Riyadh. Any plan to clean up Hormuz by force is going to cost a great deal in money and political capital, and especially in reputational damage if a large warship takes a hit on live television. If you overlay all of those layers onto a map, Hormuz starts to look less like a straight channel that America can clear and walk away from, and more like a matrix where mines, Speedboats, drones, missiles, submarines, and electronic interference are designed to compound one another into what military analysts call an integrated threat stack. In open ocean, the U.S. Navy can use distance and technological superiority to neutralize each threat individually. But in a waterway just a few dozen miles wide, with dense civilian maritime traffic, the smallest error, a misread radar, return a split-second delay in a decision, can lead to catastrophe. That is precisely why, despite possessing overwhelmingly superior military technology, the United States still has to tread carefully when confronting the machine Tehran has built at Hormuz. Against this dark backdrop, there is one variable that complicates everything. It comes from Beijing. By most estimates, roughly 90% of Iran's oil exports flow to China. In return, China provides technology infrastructure investment and a critical component of Tehran's diplomatic shield at the United Nations Security Council. Every decision Tehran makes about opening or closing Hormuz has to be measured against a single question. How does this affect Beijing's interests? During the current escalation, while ships flying Western flags have largely stopped moving, Iranian oil has continued flowing toward China through vessels that have been permitted to pass. In certain periods, Iran has actually been exporting more oil than it was before the conflict began. This is the central paradox of the Hormuz card. Iran needs the strait closed enough that Western economies feel real economic pain. But it also needs Hormuz open enough not to rupture the single most important relationship keeping its economy alive. Close it too deeply for too long, and China is not just cut off from supply. Beijing begins reconsidering the value of backing an ally that is actively destabilizing its own growth. Open it too widely, and Hormuz reverts to being a normal trade route. The pressure dissolves, and Iran loses its most powerful bargaining chip. Against that backdrop, Western analysts have arrived at a counterintuitive conclusion. On the strictly military front, Iran is being outgunned. Warships destroyed bases, struck nuclear and military infrastructure under constant pressure to repair. But on the front that controls the flow of global energy, at least in the short term, Iran appears to be setting the tempo for the rest of the world. CNN has reported that simply by striking commercial vessels, Iran effectively closed the shipping lane that carries 1/5 of the world's oil supply, granting Tehran a form of leverage that vastly exceeds what its defense budget alone would suggest is possible. Foreign Policy noted in an early March briefing that after more than 10 days of sustained airstrikes, the bulk of the Revolutionary Guard's small boat fleet retained enough capability to continue generating instability. Analysts emphasized that shore-based anti-ship missiles may have been degraded by air campaigns, but the stockpiles of drones, torpedoes, and mines remain difficult to fully neutralize. And as long as those stockpiles exist, the market cannot conclude that Hormuz is safe. One naval expert described Hormuz as an integrated threat stack, where every direction carries risk beneath the surface, on the surface, and in the air above. There is simply no way to fully eliminate that risk on a short timeline. Notably, American media has also pointed to vulnerabilities on the U.S. side. The Navy retired its last dedicated mine countermeasure vessels, home-ported in the Persian Gulf region in late 2025, replacing them with more flexible platforms that are less optimized for mine clearance operations in shallow water. That means at precisely the moment Iran began deploying mines as a primary tool of disruption, America's specialized mine hunting capability in the region was at its lowest point in years. This is not the root cause of the crisis, but it is a significant detail because it underscores a broader reality. In this confrontation, Iran has been the side that chose the battlefield. To summarize, from Washington to New York, from oil company boardrooms to households carrying a 30-year mortgage, all of us are living in the shadow of a maritime corridor just a few dozen miles long. Every time Hormuz shakes, U.S. energy markets have to recalibrate. Gas prices, freight costs, production costs, inflation expectations, interest rates, all of them shift. Iran's strategy, however effective in the short run, carries real internal limits. Their economy is running inflation above 40%. The national currency has been in a prolonged slide, and government revenue is heavily dependent on oil. Every week, Hormuz remains disrupted. Tehran is also bleeding a critical portion of its own cash flow. At this point, there is one question we can no longer avoid. If Iran can apply economic pressure through Hormuz without winning a single military engagement, then what does winning at Hormuz actually mean for the United States? And more importantly, what price is the American public prepared to pay for any of the available options? One scenario favored by those who advocate a hardline approach is using overwhelming military force to permanently dismantle Iran's deterrence capability at Hormuz. That could mean large-scale strikes on mine stockpiles, missile launch sites, fast boat bases, drone facilities, and military infrastructure deep inside Iranian territory. In theory, if those strikes are precise and sustained enough, they could seriously degrade Tehran's ability to threaten commercial and military vessels. However, the cost would extend well beyond a surge in the defense budget. It would carry the real risk of a widened war, potentially drawing in proxy forces, Iranian regional allies, and consequences across the broader region that no one can fully predict. The opposite scenario is accepting that Iran holds a certain Hormuz card and focusing instead on reducing America's own vulnerability. That means diversifying energy supply chains, expanding domestic production, deepening cooperation with alternative suppliers, and investing in transportation infrastructure, strategic reserves, and renewable energy. From this perspective, rather than trying to eliminate the risk from Hormuz entirely, the United States works to make shocks from that strait less damaging to its own economy. However, this path carries a political cost of its own. It can be read as a signal of weakness, setting a precedent that any nation controlling a strategic choke point can use it as leverage against Washington. Between those two extremes lies a gray zone where American administrations have in practice almost always had to operate. Limited military operations targeting the most immediate threats, insurance guarantees, and financial support packages designed to keep commercial vessels moving through Hormuz, diplomatic efforts to persuade Gulf states and other major powers to share the burden of maintaining open sea lanes, and domestically difficult decisions about whether to release or replenish the strategic petroleum reserve, how aggressively to prioritize clean energy investment, and how to explain to voters that no solution comes without a price, and that every choice carries a different category of risk. A strip of water 20 miles wide in the Middle East can determine mortgage costs, gas prices, and even election outcomes in the United States. Iran is simply the most vivid current example of a broader pattern. Tomorrow, it could be a different country, a different shipping lane, a different supply chain. The real question is not how to make Hormuz permanently cease to be a problem. The real question is how the United States and its people can remain resilient in a world where shocks like this one will keep returning, wearing different names and different shapes. I'm Tommy. This channel delivers comprehensive objective analysis of the US and global economy. If this video gave you something to think about, make sure you hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what we put out next. Thank you for watching.